The morning sun cast long golden shadows across the ancient cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, creating intricate patterns that danced between the iron railings as hundreds of eager tourists gathered behind the magnificent gates. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves mixed with the exhaust fumes. From the constant stream of red double-decker buses that rumbled past on the busy London streets, among the ever-growing crowd of camera-wielding visitors from every corner of the world stood 7-year-old Emma Thompson, her tiny hand clutched tightly in her grandmother's weathered but gentle palm. Emma's bright blue eyes, as clear and innocent as a summer sky, were fixed with unwavering fascination on the imposing figure standing like a statue at his designated post. The Royal Guard, Sergeant Michael Hayes, towered above the gathering crowd in his magnificent red tunic, the fabric so perfectly pressed it seemed to gleam in the morning light. His towering black bearskin hat added at least another foot to his already impressive height, making him appear almost mythical to the small girl who had never seen anything quite so grand in her 7 years of life. Sergeant Hayes had been stationed at his post for nearly 3 hours already, his weathered face a masterpiece of professional stoicism that had been carefully crafted and refined through countless hours of rigorous military training. Discipline that had been drilled into him through years of dedicated service to the crown. His dark brown eyes stared straight ahead with laser-like focus, never wavering, never blinking more than absolutely necessary. His breathing was so carefully controlled and measured that his broad chest barely rose and fell, giving him the appearance of a life-size toy soldier that had somehow been magically brought to life. Emma had been looking forward to this special trip to London for what felt like forever to her young mind. Her grandmother Rose, a spry woman of 72 with silver hair that caught the light like spun silk and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners from decades of laughter and smiles, had promised months ago to show her granddaughter all the famous sights that made London one of the most magical cities in the world. They had already visited the Tower of London, where Emma had gasped in wonder at the crown jewels, and taken a boat ride along the Thames, where she had marveled at the ancient bridges and historic buildings that lined the famous river. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had captured the little girl's vivid imagination quite like the legendary stories of the Queen's Guard that her grandmother had told her during their long flight from their home in rural Yorkshire. Rose had explained in her gentle, storytelling voice how these special soldiers were chosen from the finest regiments in the British Army. How they underwent months of intensive training, not just in military matters, but in the art of remaining absolutely motionless for hours at a time. How they were not allowed to move, speak, or react to anything happening around them while they stood their sacred duty protecting the royal residences. To Emma's young and wonderfully active imagination, these guards seemed like real-life toy soldiers who had stepped straight out of one of her favorite storybooks, standing so perfectly still and looking so magnificent in their bright red uniforms that she wondered with childlike curiosity if they were even real people underneath those spectacular uniforms, or if they might be some kind of magical beings who had been enchanted to guard the palace forever. The crowd around them buzzed with excitement and constant chatter in dozens of different languages as tourists from Japan, America, Germany, France, and countless other countries took endless selfies and pointed excitedly at the motionless guard. Some visitors, particularly groups of teenagers and young adults, who seemed to view the whole thing as some sort of entertaining challenge, tried various tactics to make the guard smile, flinch, or show any sign that he was aware of their presence. They waved their hands energetically in front of his face, made ridiculous faces, told loud jokes, and even performed impromptu dances, all hoping to capture the perfect video for their social media accounts. But Sergeant Hayes remained completely unmoved through every attempt, his eyes fixed steadily straight ahead as if he were looking at something infinitely important in the distance that only he could see. His breathing remained controlled and steady, his posture absolutely perfect, his hands positioned precisely at his sides with military precision. He had spent years mastering the incredibly difficult art of becoming a living statue, a skill that required not only immense mental discipline and unwavering focus, but also extraordinary physical endurance and strength. Emma watched and growing, fascination as people came and went in waves throughout the morning. But the guard never moved so much as a single muscle. She tugged insistently on her grandmother's thick wool coat and whispered a stream of questions in her sweet, curious voice. Did his feet hurt from standing so long in those heavy black boots? Did he ever get tired holding that big rifle? Was he allowed to blink his eyes? Could he hear everything people were saying to him? Did he want to smile, but wasn't allowed to? How did he go to the bathroom? When was he allowed to eat lunch? Rose smiled warmly at her granddaughter's endless curiosity and explained patiently that the guards were specially trained soldiers who had dedicated their lives to protecting important places and people. They had to be incredibly strong, both mentally and physically, and very brave to do their job properly. It was one of the highest honors in the British military to be selected as a Queen's Guard, and they took their responsibility very seriously. As the morning slowly progressed and turned into early afternoon, Emma began to notice something that all the other tourists seemed to be missing completely in their excitement. While the guard's tall, imposing body remained perfectly still like a statue carved from stone, she caught subtle, almost invisible changes in his expression when children approached his post. His eyes, though remaining focused straight ahead as required by his training, seemed to soften almost imperceptibly when a baby cried in its mother's arms, or when young children pointed at him with wonder and excitement, or when families gathered near him to take their holiday photographs. There was something almost gentle, something unexpectedly tender about the way he held himself when families with small children stood nearby, as if he was aware of their presence and wanted to be as non-threatening as possible, despite his intimidating size and formal military bearing. Emma, who had always been an unusually observant and sensitive child, began to study the guard more carefully, trying to understand and connect with the real person who existed beneath that magnificent but imposing uniform. As the afternoon sun climbed higher into the cloudy London sky and the temperature began to rise noticeably, Emma's keen observation skills allowed her to notice that the guard was beginning to show very small, almost invisible signs of physical strain that none of the other tourists seemed to be aware of or concerned about. Though his military posture remained absolutely perfect and unwavering, she could see tiny beads of perspiration beginning to form along his forehead and temples, despite the cool autumn breeze that rustled through the plane trees. Lining the palace grounds, Dada's breathing, while still maintaining the controlled, disciplined rhythm that his training demanded, seemed to require just slightly more effort than it had when she first began watching him hours earlier. Emma realized with growing concern that this man had been standing in exactly the same position for what must have been several hours now without moving even an inch, without eating anything, without drinking so much as a sip of water, and without any kind of break or relief from his duties. The crowd had grown significantly larger and more boisterous as the day progressed. The tour groups, school children, and individual families arriving in steady streams for the famous changing of the guard ceremony that would take place later in the afternoon. The noise level had increased dramatically, with tour guides shouting information in multiple languages, children laughing and playing, and the constant clicking and beeping of cameras and smartphones creating a cacophony of modern urban sounds. Some visitors had become increasingly aggressive and disrespectful in their attempts to get some kind of reaction from the stoic guard, seemingly treating him more like an interactive museum exhibit than a real human being performing an important and demanding job. They made increasingly loud noises right next to his ear, jumped suddenly in front of him, hoping to startle him, pretended to trip and fall near his perfectly polished boots, and even went so far as to wave food in front of his face, apparently thinking it was amusing to tempt someone who couldn't respond. Through every single provocation and disturbance, Sergeant Hayes maintained his professional composure with remarkable discipline and self-control. But Emma's sensitive and empathetic nature allowed her to see the extra effort it was taking him to ignore the increasingly disruptive behavior. She noticed how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when someone was particularly rude, how his fingers pressed just slightly more firmly against his rifle when people got too close, and how his breathing became just a fraction more controlled when he was being harassed. A rowdy group of teenage boys, probably around 15 or 16 years old and clearly on some kind of school trip, had gathered near the guard's position, laughing loudly among themselves and daring each other to get closer and be more outrageous in their attempts to break his concentration. They were treating the entire situation like some kind of game or contest, completely oblivious to the fact that they were dealing with a real person who deserved their respect rather than their mockery. One of the boys, a tall, gangly youth with messy brown hair and an obnoxious laugh, started making increasingly ridiculous faces and silly gestures just inches from the guard's face, while his friends stood behind him recording everything on their smartphones, probably planning to post the videos on social media later to show their friends back home how brave and funny they had been. The boy began making weird noises, imitating animal sounds, and even started doing a ridiculous dance right in front of the dot. Guards post at Emma watched with growing indignation and anger as these older children mocked and harassed someone who was simply trying to do his job with dignity and professionalism. She thought about all the stories her beloved grandfather had told her about military service, about honor and duty, about treating others with kindness and respect, especially those who served their community and country. The guard reminded her so much of her grandfather in his old military photographs, standing proud and dignified in his dress uniform, representing something important and worthy of respect. Her grandfather, who had passed away just 8 months earlier after a long illness, had served in the Royal Navy during his younger years and had always taught Emma to treat people with courtesy and consideration, especially those in uniform who had dedicated their lives to serving others. He would have been absolutely horrified to see these young people behaving so disrespectfully toward a member of the military, and Emma felt a surge of protective anger on behalf of both her grandfather's memory and this unknown soldier who couldn't defend himself, her grandmother. Rose noticed Emma's increasingly concerned and upset expression and bent down to ask in a gentle, worried voice what was troubling her. Emma pointed toward the guard with her small finger and whispered urgently that she thought people were being mean and unfair to him. She wondered aloud in her sweet, caring voice if he was getting hungry standing there for so long, if he was thirsty and needed water, if his feet hurt from standing in those heavy boots for hours, or if he was getting tired and needed to sit down for a while. Rose's heart melted at her granddaughter's compassionate concern for a stranger, and she explained gently that the guards were very well trained and physically fit, and that this was an important part of their duty that they took very seriously. She told Emma that the guards were relieved regularly and were given breaks, food, and water when they were off duty. But Emma's naturally compassionate heart wasn't entirely satisfied with that practical explanation, because she could see with her own eyes that this particular guard was showing signs of strain and fatigue, and people were treating him badly right now, as the teenage boys continued their increasingly disruptive and disrespectful antics. Laughing and encouraging each other to be even more outrageous, Emma made a decision that surprised not only her grandmother, but also herself. She had never been a particularly bold or outgoing child, usually preferring to observe situations quietly rather than inserting herself into them. But something about this situation stirred her sense of justice and compassion so strongly that she felt compelled to act, very gently but determinedly. She pulled her small hand away from Rose's comforting grasp and began walking slowly and purposefully toward the guard's position. Her movement was noticed immediately by other tourists in the crowd, and some of them started taking pictures and videos, automatically assuming that they were about to witness yet another attempt by a child to break the guard's legendary concentration and stoic demeanor. But Emma's intentions were entirely different from what anyone in the gathered crowd expected or had ever witnessed before at this famous tourist destination. Instead of trying to make the guard react through silly antics or childish games, instead of attempting to break his professional concentration for her own amusement or to create a memorable video, Emma simply walked up to his position with quiet dignity and respect, then stood as still as her small 7-year-old body could manage, looking up at his face with genuine concern and sincere empathy, standing before the towering guard. Emma looked incredibly small and vulnerable, almost like a little bird that had somehow found itself in the shadow of a great oak tree. Her blonde curls, which had been carefully brushed that morning by her grandmother, caught the afternoon sunlight and seemed to glow with an almost angelic radiance. She tilted her small head back as far as she could manage to meet his eyes, which required her to crane her neck at an uncomfortable angle because of his impressive height. For several long, meaningful moments, she simply stood there in respectful silence, her small hands clasped politely behind her back in an unconscious but touching imitation of his formal military posture. The crowd around them had grown noticeably quiet, sensing instinctively that something very different and special was happening before their eyes, something that went far beyond the usual tourist interactions they had witnessed throughout the day. The teenage boys who had been causing such a disturbance just moments before found their laughter dying away as they watched this tiny girl approach the situation with such obvious respect and dignity. Even they could sense that what they were witnessing was something remarkable and entirely unexpected, something that made their own behavior seem suddenly childish and inappropriate in comparison then. In a voice so soft and sincere that it seemed to float through the air like something precious and rare, a voice that carried clearly despite its gentle volume because of the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate area. Emma spoke directly to the guard. Her words were simple but profound in their genuine kindness and consideration. "Excuse me?" "Sir," she said, with the same polite formality that she would use when addressing any adult she had just met, her voice carrying the natural sweetness and innocence that only a young child can possess. "I know you're not supposed to talk or move while you're working. I don't want to get you in trouble with your bosses. But I just wanted to say thank you for protecting everyone and keeping us all safe. My grandma told me that you're very brave and very strong, and that your job is very important." The words seemed to hang in the air like something magical and unexpected, creating a moment of perfect silence and stillness that felt almost sacred in its purity and sincerity. Several tourists who had been holding up their cameras and smartphones found themselves slowly lowering their devices, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something far more meaningful and touching than the usual attempts to break a guard's concentration that they had come to expect. And Emma continued speaking in her gentle, caring voice, her blue eyes fixed on the guard's face with unwavering sincerity and genuine concern for his well-being. "Are you okay standing there for so long? You've been in the same spot for such a long time, and I was wondering if you might be getting tired. Are your feet hurting in those big boots? Are you getting hungry or thirsty? I know you can't answer me because you're working, but I just wanted you to know that someone cares about how you're feeling, Sergeant." Hayes felt something profound and unexpected shift deep inside his chest. Like a wall that had been carefully built over years of military training and professional discipline suddenly developing small cracks that let in warm sunlight. In all his years of dedicated service, through countless hours of standing guard, while thousands of people passed by his post, through endless attempts by tourists to make him laugh, smile, or break his concentration through every conceivable method, no one had ever approached him with such pure, genuine concern for his personal welfare and comfort. No one had ever simply asked if he was okay, if he needed anything, if he was uncomfortable or in any kind of distress. No one had ever treated him first and foremost as a human being who might have physical needs, emotional feelings, or personal concerns that went beyond his role as a tourist attraction or a challenge to overcome. The little girl's sincere questions and obvious care touched something deep within him that years of military training and professional protocols hadn't prepared him for or taught him how to handle. Emma noticed the subtle but unmistakable change in his expression, the way his dark brown eyes seemed to focus more directly on her face, even though his head hadn't moved from its required position, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes that suggested he was truly seeing her as an individual rather than just another face in the endless crowd of tourists that passed before him every day. Encouraged by this small but meaningful sign of acknowledgement in human connection, she continued speaking in her naturally gentle and caring voice, her words flowing from a heart that was filled with genuine kindness and empathy. "I think you're doing a very important and special job, and I think you're very good at it. You're standing so straight and strong, just like my grandfather used to do when he was in the Navy. He would be very proud of how well you're doing your duty in protecting everyone." The mention of her grandfather brought sudden, unexpected tears to Emma's bright blue eyes, but she blinked them back with the same kind of brave determination that she had seen in old photographs of her grandfather in his military uniform. The loss was still fresh and painful for her young heart, but thinking about him gave her strength and helped her understand why this guard's service was so important and deserving of respect. She reached into her small pink backpack, the one her grandmother had bought her specially for this trip to London, and carefully pulled out something she had been saving for later in the day as a special treat. It was a chocolate bar that Rose had bought for her at their hotel's gift shop that morning. Still perfectly wrapped in its bright silver foil with colorful lettering that promised it was made with the finest Belgian chocolate. Emma looked at the chocolate bar for a long moment, considering what she was about to do, and looked back up at the guard's face with decision and determination written clearly across her young features. Her next action would surprise everyone present and create a moment that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. "I know you can't eat this right now because you're still working and have to follow all the important rules," Emma said softly, carefully placing the chocolate bar at the base of the ornate guardhouse near his perfectly polished black boots, positioning it where he would be able to see it but where it wouldn't interfere with his duties or cause him any trouble with his superiors. "But maybe when you're finished working for the day, you could have it if you want to. My grandma always tells me that chocolate makes everything better when you're tired or sad or your feet hurt from walking too much." Her gesture was so pure, so thoughtful, and so completely unexpected that several people in the growing crowd felt their eyes welling up with sudden, overwhelming emotion. Here was a 7-year-old child who had recognized the humanity in someone that most adults were treating as nothing. It's more than a colorful attraction. Someone who had thought to offer comfort and kindness to a stranger who couldn't ask for help or even acknowledge that he might need it. What happened next surprised everyone who witnessed it, including Sergeant Hayes himself, who had spent years believing that his professional training had prepared him for every possible situation he might encounter while on duty. Despite years of rigorous military discipline that had taught him to remain absolutely motionless regardless of whatever circumstances might arise around him. Despite countless hours of practice and conditioning that had made maintaining his stoic expression second nature, something about this little girl's completely genuine kindness and innocent compassion broke through every professional barrier he had so carefully constructed. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the first crack appearing in a dam that had been holding back a great reservoir of water, the corner of his mouth began to twitch upward. It was such a small movement that someone who wasn't watching carefully might have missed it entirely. But Emma was watching with the focused attention that only a child can bring to something that truly matters to them, and she saw it immediately. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as they watched something that many of them had believed was impossible happening right before their eyes. This legendary guard, who had maintained his stern, unmovable expression through every provocation and attempt to break his concentration that they had witnessed throughout the day, was actually beginning to smile. And it wasn't the result of someone trying to make him laugh through silly antics or attempting to startle him with sudden movements or loud noises. Instead, it was a completely natural human response to unexpected kindness, genuine care, an innocent compassion from someone who had approached him not as a challenge to overcome or entertainment to enjoy, but as a fellow human being deserving of respect and consideration. The smile continued to grow slowly across his weathered face, transforming his entire appearance from that of a stern, unapproachable military figure into that of a kind, warm human being who was genuinely touched by what he had experienced. Emma's eyes widened with pure wonder and delight as she watched the guard's transformation, her small face lighting up with joy that seemed to radiate outward and touch everyone who was watching. She clapped her small hands together softly, careful not to make too much noise that might disturb him or get him in trouble. I whispered with heartfelt sincerity, "You have a really nice smile, sir. It makes your whole face look kind and friendly. You should smile more often when you're not working, her." Innocent joy at seeing his humanity shine through his formal exterior was absolutely infectious, spreading through the crowd like warm sunshine breaking through clouds after a storm. Even the teenagers who had been making fun of the guard earlier The ones who had been treating him like some kind of amusing challenge rather than a person deserving of respect found themselves smiling at the touching scene unfolding before them, perhaps beginning to understand for the first time what they had been doing wrong. But the surprises weren't over yet, and what happened next would create a moment that would be talked about, shared, and remembered long after everyone present had returned to their homes around the world. Sergeant Hayes, moved by emotions that he hadn't expected to feel while performing his official duties, touched by kindness that he had never experienced in quite this way before, did something that went against every single rule in his extensive training manual and military protocols, moving with the same slow, careful deliberation that characterized all his actions while on duty. He slowly and very carefully lifted his right hand from its prescribed position at his side. The movement was precise and controlled, every inch deliberate and meaningful. As he raised his hand to his temple and gave Emma a small but unmistakably genuine military salute, it was a gesture of respect from one person to another, a soldier acknowledging not just a child's kindness, but her courage, compassion, and dignity. The salute was brief but unmistakably heartfelt, executed with the same precision and care that he brought to every aspect of his military service, but infused with a warmth and personal meaning that transcended mere protocol and procedure. It was a moment of pure human connection that bridged the gap between formal duty and personal feeling. Between adult and child, between stranger and friend, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. But this wasn't the kind of cheering and clapping that usually followed someone successfully. Getting a reaction from one of the famous guards, this applause was completely different in quality and meaning, filled with genuine emotion, appreciation, and respect for what they had all been privileged to witness. It was the kind of applause that acknowledged something truly special and meaningful had just taken place before their eyes. People throughout the crowd were wiping tears from their eyes, pulling out handkerchiefs to dab at faces that had been unexpectedly moved by the simple beauty of the interaction they had witnessed. Parents were pointing out to their own children how Emma's approach had been different from everyone else's, how her kindness and respect had created something beautiful and meaningful that went far beyond mere entertainment or tourist attraction. Emma returned the salute in her own endearingly childish way, standing as straight and tall as her small 7-year-old body could possibly manage, her face serious with concentration as she tried to match his military precision. She had never received a military salute before in her young life, and she understood instinctively that it was a great honor, something special and important that she would remember for the rest of her life. The moment felt absolutely sacred to Emma, like something from a fairy tale or a dream. A magical connection between two people who had found understanding and mutual respect, despite all the formal barriers and protocols that should have kept them completely separate. She felt proud and honored in a way that her young heart had never experienced before, understanding somehow that she had been part of something truly special and important. An elderly gentleman in the crowd, distinguished-looking with silver hair and wearing a navy blazer with what appeared to be military insignia on the lapel, was visibly moved by what he had just witnessed. His eyes were bright with unshed tears as he approached Emma's grandmother, Rose, who was watching her granddaughter with a mixture of pride, amazement, and overwhelming love. "Madam," the elderly gentleman said in a cultured British accent, removing his cap respectfully as he spoke, "I am Colonel James Morrison, retired from Her Majesty's Royal Regiment, and in all my 43 years of military service, including tours of duty in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, and Afghanistan, I have never seen anything quite like what your granddaughter just accomplished here today. She has reminded us all what real respect, genuine kindness, and true human dignity look like." Other tourists gathered around to nod in enthusiastic agreement, many of them looking somewhat ashamed as they realized how differently they had been treating the guards compared to how this young child had approached the situation. Several parents made quiet comments to their children about Emma's example, using her behavior as a teaching moment about how to treat others with respect and consideration. A middle-aged woman from Germany, who spoke English with a heavy accent but with obvious sincerity, approached Emma directly and said, "Little girl, you have shown all of us adults how we should behave. You have taught us something very important today about kindness and respect. Thank you for being such a good example." Her words were echoed by murmurs of agreement from people throughout the crowd as news of the touching encounter began spreading through social media platforms. With dozens of people uploading their videos and photographs of the interaction, the story started going viral around the world at an unprecedented rate. Within hours, the footage was being shared on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, reaching millions of people across different continents and cultures who were all moved by Emma's simple but profound act of kindness and the guards' unexpected but heartfelt response. Comments poured in from people in Australia, Canada, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, and countless other countries, all expressing how touched they were by what they had seen. The story became an international symbol of how genuine human compassion and respect could bridge any gap, whether it existed between different ages, cultures, social positions, or even the formal barriers created by duty and protocol. Back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Hayes had gradually returned to his required stoic stance and professional demeanor. But something fundamental and permanent had changed within him during those precious moments of human connection. For the remainder of his shift that day, which lasted another 2 hours until the official changing of the guard ceremony, he found himself more aware of and connected to the individual people in the crowd rather than seeing them as simply a general mass of anonymous tourists to be ignored and endured. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. During his years of service, he saw parents patiently teaching their young children about respect and proper behavior. He observed elderly visitors sharing stories with their grandchildren about their own military service or that of family members who had served their countries. He noticed other children looking at him with the same sense of wonder and curiosity that Emma had shown, and he found himself hoping that they too possessed her natural kindness and empathy. The chocolate bar that Emma had so thoughtfully left remained exactly where she had placed it, at the base of the ornate guardhouse, a small but powerful symbol of human thoughtfulness and generosity that didn't go unnoticed by the other guards who arrived for the elaborate changing ceremony that tourists came from around the world to witness. When the ceremony began with its precise military choreography, the incoming guards were immediately curious about the chocolate bar and the story behind it. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the regiment like wildfire, with senior officers and enlisted men alike sharing the tale of the little girl who had approached one of their colleagues, not to mock or challenge him, but simply to show him kindness, respect, and genuine human concern for his welfare. The story became an instant legend within the Guards community, a reminder to all of them that behind their formal duties and rigid protocols, they were still human beings who deserved to be treated with dignity and consideration. It reinforced their understanding of why their service mattered and gave them a renewed sense of pride in representing not just military excellence, but the very best of human character and values. Several hours later, when Sergeant Hayes finally finished his demanding shift and was officially relieved of his duties, he walked over to where Emma's chocolate bar still lay waiting for him. He picked it up with the same careful attention he brought to handling his military equipment, holding it gently as if it were something precious and irreplaceable. He unwrapped the chocolate slowly and deliberately, taking time to appreciate not just the gift itself, but everything it represented about human kindness, generosity, and the unexpected connections that could form between strangers. He took a small bite and was surprised to discover that it really did make him feel better after his long, physically demanding day of standing at attention and maintaining perfect posture for hours on end. But more than the physical comfort the chocolate provided, it was what the gift represented that truly nourished his spirit. He decided to save the rest of it, not because he wasn't hungry or because he didn't enjoy the taste, but because it had become something far more valuable than mere candy. It was a tangible reminder of a moment when someone had seen past his uniform and his formal role to recognize him as a fellow human, being deserving of care and consideration. That evening, in the quiet privacy of his small but comfortable quarters within the military barracks, Sergeant Hayes did something he had never done before in his entire military career. He sat down at his simple wooden desk, pulled out a piece of official military letterhead, and began writing a detailed report about the day's incident. This wasn't because such a report was required by military regulations or because he had been ordered to document what had occurred, but because he felt deep in his heart that the little girl's extraordinary kindness and remarkable maturity deserved to be officially recognized and remembered in his careful, precise handwriting. He described how Emma's respectful approach and genuine concern for his welfare had reminded him and everyone who witnessed the interaction why he was proud to serve in his prestigious position. He wrote about how her simple act of human kindness had demonstrated the very values that the Queen's Guard was meant to protect and represent: dignity, respect, honor, and the recognition that every person deserves to be treated with basic human decency, regardless of their role or position in society. He submitted the report to his commanding officer the next morning, along with a formal recommendation that Emma be recognized in some appropriate way for her outstanding example of. The report worked its way up through the military chain of command, eventually reaching the highest levels of the palace administration, where it caught the attention of senior officials who were responsible for public relations and community outreach. Meanwhile, the story of Emma and the Royal Guard continued spreading far beyond social media into mainstream news outlets around the world. Major television networks, newspapers, and online news services picked up the story, recognizing that people everywhere were hungry for positive news about human kindness and connection in a world that often seemed focused on conflict, division, and negativity. The footage of Emma's interaction with Sergeant Hayes was broadcast on morning news programs in the United States, featured in primetime news broadcasts across Europe, and shared on social media platforms in countries where most people had never even heard of the British Royal Guard before. It became a universal story that transcended cultural and national boundaries, touching hearts and inspiring people regardless of their background or nationality. Child psychologists and education experts were interviewed about Emma's behavior, using her example to discuss how children could be taught empathy, respect, and consideration for others. Military historians talked about the significance of the Guard's response and what it revealed about the human side of military service. Social commentators used the story to highlight the importance of treating service members and public servants with dignity and appreciation rather than viewing them merely as entertainment or curiosities. 3 months after their memorable London trip, Emma received an unexpected package in the mail at her family's home in Yorkshire. The package was substantial and official-looking, wrapped in brown paper and bearing the distinctive royal coat of arms. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden presentation box containing an official letter written on the finest royal letterhead and addressed specifically to her in elegant calligraphy. The letter was from Sergeant Hayes himself, who had been given special permission by his superiors to write to her. After her story had reached the attention of senior palace officials and even members of the royal household staff, the letter had been reviewed and approved at the highest levels before being sent, making it an unprecedented communication between a serving guard and a member of the public. In his letter, written in language that was formal but warm, Sergeant Hayes thanked Emma not only for her personal kindness to him, but for reminding him and all of his fellow guards about the true importance and dignity of their work. He explained that her approach had become a story shared throughout the entire regiment, inspiring guards at all levels to remember that their duty was not simply about following protocols and maintaining traditions, but about serving people with honor, integrity, and humanity. The letter revealed that Emma's spontaneous act of compassion had actually led to significant changes in how new guards were trained and prepared for their duties. Her story had become an official part of the curriculum for new recruits, taught alongside lessons about military history, protocol, and procedure. Trainers now told new guards about the little girl who had approached a colleague not to test him or entertain herself, but simply to show him kindness, respect, and genuine human concern. The letter also disclosed that Emma's story had inspired the creation of a new tradition within the Queen's Guard, A small plaque had been installed near the guardhouse where their encounter had taken place, bearing a simple inscription that read, "In recognition of the power of kindness and respect to bridge all differences," while the plaque didn't mention Emma by name. Sergeant Hayes explained that everyone in the regiment knew exactly what it commemorated and why it was important. Enclosed with the letter was a special commemorative pin, beautifully crafted in silver and enamel, featuring the royal coat of arms and inscribed with the words, "For distinguished service to the Crown." Sergeant Hayes explained that this pin was normally given only to distinguished visitors to the palace, foreign dignitaries, and individuals who had performed exceptional service to the royal household. Emma was believed to be the youngest person ever to receive such an honor. The letter concluded with Sergeant Hayes sharing that he had kept the chocolate bar wrapper that Emma had given him, and that it now held a place of honor in a small display case in the Guards' common room alongside other meaningful mementos and remembrances from significant moments in the regiment's history. It had become a symbol among the Guards of how small acts of kindness could have profound and lasting impact, reminding them daily of the human connections that made their service meaningful. Emma's story had also inspired a remarkable change in visitor behavior at Buckingham Palace and other royal residences where Guards were stationed. Instead of trying to make the Guards laugh, react, or break protocol for their own entertainment, more and more visitors began following Emma's example of treating them with quiet respect, dignity, and appreciation for their service. Tour guides began incorporating Emma's story into their presentations, using it as an example of how tourists could show proper respect for the Guards while still enjoying their visit to Eds. These historic sites, parents started bringing their children specifically to thank the Guards for their service, rather than treating them as interactive attractions or challenges to overcome. Change in atmosphere around the guard posts was noticeable. To everyone who worked at the palace, Guards reported feeling more respected and appreciated by visitors, and the incidence of harassment or inappropriate behavior decreased significantly. Emma's simple act of kindness had created ripples of positive change that extended far beyond that single moment of connection. Years later, as Emma grew into adolescence and then young adulthood, she would often look back on that autumn day in London as one of the most important and formative experiences of her childhood. The encounter had taught her that treating others with kindness, respect, and genuine concern for their well-being could create moments of profound human connection that lasted. Far beyond the immediate interaction, she learned that every person, regardless of their job, position, or circumstances, was deserving of basic human dignity and consideration. The experience shaped her character and influenced her interactions with others throughout her life. From teachers and classmates to service workers and professionals she pursued her education and eventually her career. The lessons she learned that day about empathy, respect, and the courage to do the right thing even when others around you are behaving poorly became fundamental parts of who she was as a person. She often told the story to friends and eventually to her own children, using it as an example of how small acts of kindness could make a significant difference in someone's day and even change how people thought about treating others. The chocolate bar wrapper, carefully preserved by Sergeant Hayes and eventually framed in the Guards' display case, became something of a pilgrimage site for new recruits and visiting dignitaries who were told the story during tours of the facility. It served as a permanent reminder that beneath every uniform, behind every role or title, was a human being deserving of respect, kindness, and consideration. Emma's encounter with the Royal Guard ultimately became more than just a viral video or a heartwarming news story that people shared on social media for a few days before moving on to the next trending topic. It became a lasting testament to the power of genuine compassion, expressed simply and honestly by a child who saw past external appearances and formal barriers to recognize the shared humanity that connects all people.